You were listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast. We aim to model the discipleship conversations that should be happening on couches and around dining room tables. We're trying to grow our imaginations to think about what could and should be as we follow Jesus. We're asking ourselves questions about how we're being formed more or less like Jesus by the world around us. And we invite you into that conversation. So if you find this episode helpful, make sure to share it with a friend. Also, liking and subscribing, leaving a review, all those things help us grow and get the word out there. So please be sure to do that as well.
On this episode of the Living Room Disciple, we are wrapping up our series on politics as we head into this election season, and we simply want to take some time to focus on our spiritual formation and ask again, how are we being formed during this political season? Are we becoming more or less like Christ? That's our question today on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.
Well, in another life, I was an educator, and we educators love our tools. And so I thought maybe tonight, for ourselves and for you, listener at home, we could use a tool that I used to use in the classroom when we were wrapping up our learning for the day. Now, we've been in a series on politics and policy and how our nation, just what the flavor of it is right now, how we engage that flavor as believers. And so, as we wrap up this particular season of recording and conversation, I want to introduce this tool that's called 3-1 Next. And it's where we think of 3 of our major takeaways from this time of discussion. And we make those observations. What struck us? What would we want to share with one another about what hit us particularly deeply? And then maybe we have a question that is either lingering. Then maybe we have a question that's either lingering in our minds or that we want to ask one another that comes out of this time. And then lastly, there's this idea of how we bring this into future action. So it's that next part. What do we do with this next in our discipleship? So I wanted to present that as an idea to use here, to use at home. And I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from my brothers. What do you guys think about this season we've been in? What are 3 takeaways that you have?
Well, I'll kickstart and I'll say, I think thinking about all these conversations, I've talked about politics a lot in my life. It's been an area of interest even from when I was young. I remember, even in high school, that being an area that I was able to engage in with a lot of passion, but I don't know, I just didn't get anxious or afraid when people disagreed with me. And so I've talked about politics a lot, but I think it's been really cool over the last 2 or 3 months to see how often when we're having these conversations, keeping in mind the spiritual formation element, like how am I being formed, how little I really cared about where someone landed on an issue. You know what I mean? I felt like when my spiritual formation was at the forefront, like how am I becoming like Jesus? I think I became even more open-handed with some of my political viewpoints. You know what I mean? This or that kind of thing. And I became really introspective. Maybe that's like fear of hypocrisy. I'm saying one thing, am I living this out? Became really introspective and really started to focus even more and more on my own personal heart condition, which I'm becoming more and more convinced is the key element as a believer engaging the political spectrum.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot as our conversations have ventured from very important topic to the next very important topic. The one common thread that seems to keep coming up time and time again is just this idea of the image of God in the other, in the person that we disagree with, in the person that we can't stand, in the person that we might even end up calling demonic or evil or something like that, which requires us to then turn inward and ask how we could come to see another person like that. But I think an important question and an important lens, regardless of the political issue that we are looking at. An important lens is to go back to, the classic question that's asked to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And to remember time and time again that there's no limit to who that person is. Everybody you could possibly think of, everybody you could name fits in the category of that is your neighbor. That is a person who is loved by God and made in the image of God. And therefore, that is a person to treat with dignity and respect and honor and with the love of Christ.
I'm hearing posture of the heart. I'm hearing image bearer, love of neighbor. And I'm going to connect to those things my own 3 takeaways. And mine, I'm going to start with kind of this big picture label for each of them. And the first one is that Christians need to live with a kingdom mentality that is otherworldly.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, and this ties to what you guys are saying about the postures of our heart, the fruit of that. So the second thing for me is the fruit of the Spirit, being the way that that kingdom is characterized, that's what the kingdom looks like. It looks like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness towards those that we are maybe in disagreement with, or maybe those who are desperately in need, like stuck in a trap. I'm thinking about our conversation on abortion, for example. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control.
Yeah.
And particularly in a political season, that last one I think really rings true. This posture, if our heart's posture is in the right place, then we're going to be self-controlled with how we speak of what's going on in our nation or even around the world. We're going to be those who seek to speak even words of peace and shalom, words that help to bring shalom instead of division. And I know I had a third one. I'm going to see if I can remember what that was. I might have to punt for a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we'll ping pong.
Perfect.
When you were talking about the new kingdom, I've been thinking, and this might be partly because I'm reading through Scott McKnight's Revelation for the Rest of Us. I'm just thinking a lot about the New Jerusalem, about the new kingdom, and that's, I think, really filling my imagination right now. But I don't know. I think one of the things I've wrestled with since becoming a believer, and I haven't always had this language, but I think a lot of people listening will really resonate with this idea of what's my duty to the Lord as it relates to how I should be changing the world around me, like how I should be, you know what I mean? Like what is my duty? And I feel like I've been following Jesus for 15 years now, and my answer to that has, depending on when you've asked, would have asked me, like it would have changed so many different times. When I became a believer initially, it was to preach the gospel, to evangelize. It was to let everybody know, I kind of beat people up with the Bible,
Your job was to let everybody know that you were right.
I mean, that might still be my job. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, no, that's how I felt. In these late teens, early 20s. And then that kind of morphed to, I need to love my neighbor through initializing or being the catalyst of really large, world-changing. I had the hubris of a 25-year-old. You know what I mean? Like I was, I'm not a teen anymore. I'm wise enough to know how to, and so there was this change in mindset to this, big, and I think that's where a lot of us actually get stuck, because that's what we see politics as a key to, right? Like if I can use politics to just do my part to create changing the world in the image that I think the Lord wants it to be in. And I fully get that. Like, I think there's a lot of good to that, but I think I've recently grown in the last maybe 2-3 years to God's plan, I think my answer will probably change in 5, 10 years. But as it stands today, my role is to love the human made in the image of God that's literally physically in front of me. Like that one. Just
Right.
that one, you know? And that is of the utmost importance. And so what does it look like to treat that person as if like I am a part of the kingdom of God, like that my primary citizenship is to that kingdom. And how is it possible for me to sit beside this person of a totally different political viewpoint, to invite my neighbor over for dinner and have those conversations come up because they are, and to handle them as if my living room is both inside my house and inside the New Jerusalem. Like this is like it's this space that because I'm there, it's in two places at once. And what would that look like? And to feel like that's maybe the most important thing to some extent. I'm probably I want you all to help me build in this language here.
Well,
But
I'm
I've really been
reminded of what my third was. And it's
Perfect.
because
all
you drew
right.
it out.
Okay, good.
Because what I'm remembering, my third is related to that amazing conversation that Nick had with Brian Zond about
Mm-hmm.
the crucified king.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're talking about in terms of this love of the person who's directly in front of me, it brings to mind that servant kingship. And it makes me actually think of those He Gets Us commercials that came out, which
Oh, the
I know
Super
there's a
Bowl.
lot of controversy. Like, seriously, they're
Yeah.
controversials. Like, they're weird in some ways, but like, hear me out for a minute
Yes.
about what I'm saying.
Okay.
What you're describing about loving the person who's across from us, they might even be our enemy or an enemy to our theology or our philosophy, or even an enemy to the kingdom, like not just us personally, but an enemy to the kingdom. But what we see in this picture of Christ, the crucified king, is somebody who came while we were yet sinners to die for us. I mean, that blows my mind. And that what our work is here is to point to the servant king who came because of his great love for us. And that's not just me. He came for me when I was dead in my trespasses and sins. He came for my neighbor who may still be dead in their trespasses and sins. This kingdom is not about cleaning things up and making the economy work and making, our lives comfortable. This kingdom that the crucified king rules over, right?
Yeah.
So that is one of my major takeaways that I'm having to wrestle with and take deep into myself to help reorient that posture of my heart again. So thanks
Yeah,
for drawing that out for me.
I think it really puts more meat on the bone, not just to say, well, Jesus was like that, so we should too. Although that's true, but to say, I am somehow a physical embodiment of a kingdom that's not yet fully here. And that kingdom comes because of a servant king who came not to lord it over as the Gentiles do, but came to become a servant of all. Because I am a servant of that kingdom, I am to embody the way that Jesus lived his life, which is the way of the servant. I'm to be an ambassador, an emissary of the servant king, which means I am to act like he would act. And I think it really speaks to me in a new way, rather than just, kind of tritely saying, what would Jesus do? Which
Right.
again is a good thing to do. I think it really kind of lets you see it through a new light when you're talking about, it's not just we're just copying Jesus because it's wise to do. We're also copying Jesus because we are the ambassadors he is called to show what his kingdom looks like until he returns.
Yeah. And I don't want to cut off the takeaways. If there are a couple others that we need to do, we need to pull them out. But when you ask the question, Nick, you're making me think of, okay, so if it's not the what would Jesus do question, what is a better question for me to wrestle with in this moment? And I'm still kind of stuck on that question of what is my role in the lives of my children? And maybe it's also because I'm coming most recently from a discipleship of children podcast that I was engaging with. So
Hmm.
I'm always thinking through that layer of, okay, what is the job of the adult in the room for the sake of the children in the room? And I
Mm.
just kind of dissed that question of what would Jesus do, but I think about how Jesus said, hey, let the children come to me and do not hinder them.
Mhm.
Like he made space for the children. And that is profoundly ministering to my heart and equipping of me as a mom that this is such an important work to make space, not to just go off on my crusade or in even my martyrdom, but that a huge part of what it means for me to serve is to serve my most proximate neighbor, my children, and to make space for their discipleship. And I think about the question as pertains to our politics. How do we continue to create space for the children of this nation to come to know him? And how do we best maximize on the space that has been given to us, at least for a time, in the United States of America, this democratic republic that really provides the opportunity for people to learn and to grow and to wrestle. They're not having things like their thought processes and their behaviors mandated from a centralized government. So, as I think about discipleship in response to politics, I'm asking that question: how does
Mm.
my discipleship also need to be about caring for and tending to others? How am I making space and utilizing space for the discipleship of my children?
Mm. I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying too, but it does
Mm.
remind me, and I think it relates to a lot of the ways that we interact with politics. And so, just to be really blunt, right? Like the parent sitting on the couch, lounging in the chair, watching the news, and the words coming out of their mouth, right? And that moment, and I'll never forget. I was like 16 when I heard this, but it stuck with me. I was just a pastor who was preaching, and he said very simply, "Be the person you want your children to be."
Mm.
And I remember like how the most profound things are the simple ones, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I know, like that like hit me like a gut punch. I was like 16. My sister dragged me to church, and I was like, that makes sense to me, you know? And that's followed me throughout. What I'm getting at is we all have moments. Well, if we're parents, I think the best parents have moments where they ask themselves, is this what I want my kid to do? Am I watching what I want my kid to watch? Am I saying what I want my kid to say? Will I change my behavior if my child walks into the room? Right? Like that's just like a clear. We did this when we were kids, you know. When mom and dad came home, you know, you took those contraband toys and maybe it was just me, but
Contraband toys.
we would borrow video games that we weren't supposed to be playing.
Oh,
And oh yeah, I know. And then they'd come home. It was 007 GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. I got in trouble so bad you don't even know. They found it. It was in the bottom of the Foot Locker, but they found it. And but you knew you were up to behavior that was not becoming the standards of your parents, because when your parents walked in the room, you stopped doing the okay. But there's a reverse situation that happens too. When you're not acting in a way that's becoming of the person you want your child to be, when you know you need to adjust your behavior when your child walks into the room. And I think about that as regards to, are we creating space in our homes to be discipling our children? That in one part, anyways, the way it resonates with me, when I'm engaging in politics comes up at the dinner table, the news is on in the living room, or I see the news on my phone, whatever it is, are the thoughts that I have and the words that come out of my mouth, are they the types of thoughts and the types of words that I'd want my children
Wow.
to say too,
mhm.
and that should all be in alignment with the model of behavior that the Lord has given us through through Jesus. But I don't know, that kind of rang is maybe a takeaway just from this moment.
It's so
I think
funny
it's
that
really
you
good.
guys have turned to this talking about children, because I've been reading through Matthew, and I noticed a turn of phrase in it the other day where Jesus, it's might be in the same section where he says, "Don't hinder them from coming to me." He also says, "Anyone who wants to enter into the kingdom must humble themselves and become like one of these." In other words,
It's
for
hard.
Jesus, it's not always the adult's job to disciple the child, but sometimes it's the child's job to
Mm,
disciple the adult. And if you
Amen.
think about it, like, how many ways have we allowed our souls to be corrupted and filled with toxic sludge from all
mm,
the things? Just don't
yeah.
even have to name them, just all the things. And children don't have any of that yet. And I'm just thinking about what might it look like if I engaged this political scenario, this election season, the division, like my children are engaging it. And obviously, they don't know who Kamala Harris is. They don't know who Joe Biden is. They don't know who Donald Trump is. They don't know who any of these people are. But they are not fighting with anybody because they disagree with them, right? They might
Mm,
fight with somebody because they took their toy or whatever.
Mm.
But just the innocence to, if my kids did care about who was going to be elected president,
yeah.
how would they engage with other children on the playground, and would it look different than me? How can I be discipled by the innocence of their uncorrupted souls?
These are so great. I'm hearing, how can I be discipled by my children? I'm hearing, how would I how should I act if I would change my behavior if my children walked in the room? How then should I be acting instead? And then you guys heard my question about, how do we create space or continue to save space for the discipleship of our children? I think maybe also I'm thinking of how cluttered my space is, my how cluttered my mind is,
Yeah.
how intentional I need to be, as a part of this intentional movement into what's
Mm,
next. How do I continue to make discipleship uttermost in my practices and not allow it to be crowded out by, the worries, maybe the anxieties, back in Matthew again. And how do I live according to the kingdom descriptions that are in the Beatitudes? And I think that when we're talking about, as we have been, how politics and policy can shape our discipleship, it can form us, it can disciple us. I think one of the major takeaways that I have about what I want to do next is to continue to, instead of allowing it to form me, to allow those characteristics of the kingdom to be the things that form my political action. I want to dwell in
mm,
the word. I want to dwell in the description of the kingdom, in the description of the fruit that the Spirit bears in us. I want to dwell in those places and for those to be so saturated in my being that when I show up to, a common political, life type of, I'm kind of mixing up some of the words that Caitlin Chess helped us with a long time ago. If I'm showing up to something of our common life together, something of the political process,
mm,
that I'm showing up with that kind of posture, that instead of it forming me, I'm shaping that out of the Spirit's shaping of my heart. And
Yeah,
so the thing I want to do next is to saturate
mm.
myself even more fully in the word and go out and engage.
that's so good. It's this idea that we're all being formed, we're all being shaped, we're all becoming somebody. So we may as well be intentional to choose what we're allowing to form us and shape us, what we're allowing to dictate who we are becoming. Because if we are not intentional about it, then things that we don't want to form us are going to be forming us. So we may as well try to turn away from the things that are forming us negatively and malforming us, and try to turn towards the things that are noble and righteous and lovely and worth pursuing.
Yeah. And hopefully having our cups overflow. Like, I'm thinking
Yeah.
about,
Oh,
if I'm
yeah.
pouring all of that goodness into me, surely that's going to also
Mm.
pour out to those around me and
Mhm.
even into the political process. The decisions that I face as an adult, surely all that goodness, that righteousness that's pouring in will also pour out by the Lord's good stewardship of that. So I've had a chance to share some of what I think that I need to do next with this, but I'm really curious to hear, how do you want to bring some of this season into what you're going to do next? How you want to see it in action in your lives?
Okay, so this is really tough for me because I still have this thing in me that really likes politics. I like talking about it. I like debating it. Like getting into a good fight, like it still does something. Like I'm totally fine. Um, I joke, but I really do mean it. I feel, maybe in a more serious way, I should put, I feel like there's still ways that I want to engage in the political realm in a way to be helpful, to advocate for the things I care about. Like I really, we've talked a lot about how we're formed, but I do want to still be formed into a person who does take steps to advocacy, to loving my neighbor through action, right? Not, I mean, I say the person in front of me, and I mean that, but also creating policy for the people I'll never meet. So that's still something in my heart, and I don't know what that looks like. So I'm wrestling with that, but I think one of the things for me, as far as like a takeaway from our conversations, is going to be ensuring I don't open my mouth
Hmm.
if my heart posture isn't right. To try to like really hone in on that self-discipline, that when the topics come up, I have a lot of amazing neighbors, and in my community, not just my immediate neighbors, but like just in the community I'm in, that I know I don't align with politically. Um, and yeah, these topics are coming up. There's a lot of like, sitting down, see them in the yard talking. And I think I really want to make sure that like I've got my tongue reined in. And until I know that in this moment my heart really is postured properly, to just keep my mouth shut. And I know that may sound silly or simple, but I
Self
really think it's
control.
important. Yeah.
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 And that's why we've had this entire series without trying to tell people how to vote for things.
Dude, you know how hard it's been to keep my mouth shut? Be like, well, Nick, what people should be doing is going to
Yeah.
and then if they could just, and then this person and that policy, oh man, like it's in me
Hmm.
to draw those lines. Like that capacity for division is within me. Like I have that there. And it is through only the grace of God that I can overcome and pursue unity. Like it really, and that maybe sounds really holy, but like I'm acutely aware of how divisive I can be.
I'm refreshed by your transparency as always.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
And let me just say that I really appreciate that as we're having this conversation, that there's going to be a listener that resonates with Kelsey's next step. There's going to be a listener that resonates with Phil's next step. And God willing, there'll be a listener that resonates with my next step. But my next step is, I feel a little, I need some help fleshing it out. I'm thinking a lot about, have you guys read this? It's a
Sorry,
probably
me and Kelsey both leaned into the camera. Did you notice that?
That's
You're
fantastic.
like, I need help fleshing
Like,
it out. We're like,
I am
tell
ready.
me more.
Yeah,
Tell me more.
Put me in, coach.
We're here. We're
Yeah,
here for you.
yeah.
Like, we're here for you.
Awesome.
Okay, go on.
So have y'all read, this book is probably 20 years old, Boundaries by, I don't remember their first names, but Cloud and Townsend?
Yes.
I have talked to a number of friends who have read it and felt like it was transformative, but I've not personally read it.
It is a paradigm shift. And basically, if there's a one sentence takeaway, it's you can control a very small number of things, focus on those things, and don't try to control everybody else all the time. And I think that really applies to our politics. And I do think it's important to vote, even though my vote doesn't actually matter. But if everybody said that, obviously we're in big trouble. So my vote as an individual does not matter. But if everybody thinks my vote as an individual doesn't matter, we're in a lot of trouble, right? So my
It
vote
matters, Nick.
But my point is, my
But
vote
kind
is
of. Yeah, I
not
get what you're
changing
saying,
the
I get what you're saying.
outcome. I can't control the outcome by
Yeah.
casting a vote, is all I'm trying to say.
That is true.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And my participation in a protest doesn't control whether that protest is listened to, right?
Yeah.
There are so many things as individuals that we
Mhm.
do in our political life that we don't actually we participate, and I'm not saying don't do that at all. I'm going to vote. I think it can be a good thing to protest. I think it can be a good thing to
Yeah.
raise awareness and all of that.
Yep. But I'm tracking with you.
I think there have been a lot of times where I have been very guilty of giving so much attention and feeling so much anxiety and heartache over things that I actually have very little or no control over, while turning my attention away from the neighbor who I could practically help, or my children who need my time, rather than me sitting there tweeting something that I think is brilliant and going to change the world that's not actually changing anything, right?
You're reminding
But
me
it
of
is
another
brilliant.
book.
Well, there you go.
You're
I'm
reminding me
tracking with you.
of Stephen Covey, his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And
Classic.
yeah, like I honestly can't even get past number 3 because I've got so much to unpack and to run through a good biblical framework, which inevitably makes it accordion out into all
Yeah.
kinds of application. But what you're talking about, Nick, is that, to use his words, that sphere of influence versus
Mhm.
the realm of concern. I'm not even sure what he calls it, but there's all
I
these
think
things in that realm of concern, but that we really can't control or even have any influence on. But there is a sphere that's closer to home, like your neighbor, like your children. And that is our sphere of influence. And I have really been challenged by that idea, particularly when I start getting anxious about all those things that are out there. Okay, wait a minute. I have my greatest impact on the people who are closest to me. And it's through that ripple effect that actually other things, communities are shaped. And then ultimately, maybe even nations are shaped, but it's through pouring into those people who are right across from me. And don't get me wrong, like policy is a part of this. I mean, we have documents and we have laws that help create the space. Like I've argued before, there's a space that is created for us to actually even have a sphere that we can influence. And so they do go hand in hand. I'm not saying it's an either or situation, but let's do with the space that has been given us the maximum of what we can do. That's, I think, where I'm going with that.
There really is a deep root of maturity in understanding, like, I often am blown away as I follow Jesus with the amount of like reality checks he gives me, while also growing my imagination to like beyond what I could think, right? And what I mean by that is, on one hand, and there is a beautiful reality check to be like, technically, your vote matters like a raindrop hitting the ocean. You know what I mean? Like, we need them. You know what I mean? Like, I need the rain to keep falling. But like there is it only does so much. While also remembering that, like, that thought process can easily lead to hope or to a despair, excuse me. So like feeling like there's so little you could do leads to despair, which is its own form of spiritual immaturity. Despair is, we don't think of it that way, but it is, and understandable. I don't mean that in an offensive way. I struggle at times with despair because I am immature in my understanding of the influence and reach of God. You know what I mean? Like, my own perspective of God's ability to influence the world is so limited that sometimes I begin to think that all hope is lost, or there's nothing that I can do or should do or whatever. And so I think what you're touching on, Nick, is that beautiful balance. And I'm 100% in agreement with Kelsey. Like, what is it I can't control? And the maturity to know to know what you can and can't control. And the maturity of the spiritual maturity to know that if you control what you can, if you influence what you can, that is actually enough.
Right.
Like that is enough of an offering to the Lord to do whatever it is he has desired for you to accomplish, whatever good work he has laid out before you, that it is enough. And
Yeah.
that's not a thing to despair over, but to be excited about and joyful over.
Right.
Um,
And there's something beautiful about coming into something where I alone cannot determine an outcome, but coming into it anyway, because I know that as a group, we as a collective body can, what else is the church but a collective group who's coming together in unison to do something that none of us could do single-handedly, right? And I think it's this picture of the church when we participate corporately like that. But at the same time, I don't want to allow, I guess, my own self-esteem and my own thought that I should be able to shape policy because I know better than everybody else or something like that. I should be able to single-handedly pick the next president because I obviously know who to vote for and all those other people are wrong. But I think if I am controlling the things that I can control, if I am being intentional about loving my neighbor and serving my community and showing up for my church family and for my blood family and for my children and for my wife and if I am loving my neighbor as myself, the ripple effect of that is going to be transformative.
I have one last thought that I think, I don't know if we've hit on too much, but I think it's a really important idea to resonate on or meditate on as we end our time kind of talking about politics directly. And that's to meditate just for a moment on defeat.
That's
And
good.
I was thinking about this earlier when we were talking about the interview with Brian Zahn, talking about the slain lamb. I'm thinking a lot about it. There's that moment in Revelation, who can open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, right? And then he turns to, and you expect to see, John turns expecting to see a lion and sees a lamb that has already been slain.
Yeah.
There's a big theme that the victory of the saints comes through what appears to be earthly defeat. That the victory of the saints comes through what appears to be earthly defeat. And that the saints wage war against the powers of darkness in the spiritual realms through faithfulness to the slain lamb, so much so that they will be slain too, and in the process still hold to the fruit of the Spirit, the kindness, the love, the gentleness. And I think this is important. I sometimes I hate too sweeping of statements because I'm sure there's some exceptions out there, and so I apologize. But generally speaking, broad brush, the Christian church does not experience mass persecution in the American context, or at least physical persecution. Um, and so sometimes I think that we miss out on the earthly defeat, spiritual victory dichotomy, because it feels like spiritual victory is tied to often political victory. I mean, literally. I watched some speeches from the RNC. I watched some speeches from the DNC. Okay, because I'm a politics nerd. All right, don't judge me. Both sides throw Jesus around a lot. Both sides end with God bless, and this is what, and they, in their own ways and in their own political context, insinuate that their party is exemplifying the I really want to say this the right way. I want to say biblical values, but that has some baggage to it. They're exemplifying the Christian character, and they deserve the Christian vote. I think it's probably the most accurate and simple way to put it. Which is fine. I'm not dogging on that. I'm just saying that is what that is. But it is interesting to me because they both perceive blessing as victory, right? Their people get elected up and down the ballot. And I get that. I understand that. Again, this is not throwing shade at anybody or saying, I'm just commenting that victory, according to the story of the martyrs, is living like the Lamb, even unto earthly defeat, and expecting that slain Lamb to make all things right in the new kingdom. Like they did their part and they expected to die. Like that was what was handed to them in the early church. Do your part. You're not changing Rome. Rome's going to kill you. That's the expectation. Stay faithful until the end. And
Yeah.
it's almost like because we have the expectation that we can change America, that we think that victory must be through the change of America. And, I think it's good to remember it's not. Victory just isn't,
Mm.
that.
It's so good.
And it's good to remember that Rome failed and so many other nations failed. And yet to also remember that it was Roman roads that the feet of the evangelists trod. And so
Mm-hmm.
I keep thinking about space. How about we run all over the roads while we can to bring the gospel where we
I
can?
like that.
And yes, it is a different message, a one where victory requires death and where we have to acquaint ourselves with suffering and death, the suffering servant who died and who bids us come and die.
Mm.
Wow. I'm hoping in the next few months to have a little mini series with some good friends who will talk about death and suffering
Yeah.
and the things that have helped acquaint them with this kingdom mentality we've been talking about. And so, if I can have the honor of saying, listener, I would love to pass on this tool to you again in repetition. The 3 main takeaways from our time together, a question that you're asking yourself or even others, but this self-examination question or a question that lingers with you after this time, and a takeaway commitment. What do I want to do with this next? How will I bring this into the next step of my discipleship? So thankful to be able to have done that with you guys today.
Thank you for tuning in to the Living Room Disciple podcast. And I'm praying that this series on how we're formed by politics has been a blessing to you. And I don't blame you if it's been a struggle or if maybe you've even avoided a few of the episodes. But listen, no matter what the political topic is or the political climate or whatever is going on, we have been given what we need to act like Christ to the person in front of us and to, in some small way, bring the kingdom of heaven near in this moment. So take this tool, the 3-1 Next, and maybe have a conversation at your dining room table or in your living room. And I just want to give a huge shout out and thanks to Micah Pop for all the amazing production work, to Eric Church for getting this podcast out to the world, to Daniel Ramirez, who composed our theme music, and thank you to you for sticking around to the very end of this episode. Welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.